Hi, and welcome to Kidney Plugged In. What do yoga on the beach, a fortuitous meeting with a neighbor, and the rediscovery of a treasure trove of old photos and documents all have in common? It's one family's journey with kidney disease dating back over half a century. Patricia Crowley's late husband, Russel, was only the third kidney transplant recipient in BC. And Patricia is joined by her daughter, Charlotte, as they sit down to share their story and memory of a husband and father who battled kidney disease, received a transplant, and made a difference in the lives of his fellow kidney patients. Patricia and Charlotte open up their hearts to share their personal story of love and loss. So stay with us because you'll meet Pat and her daughter, Charlotte, next, right here on Kidney Plugged In. Pat and Charlotte, welcome. You're joining us today from Parksville on Vancouver Island. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, lovely to meet you, and we're glad for the opportunity to tell our story.
I'm very pleased to welcome you to the show because you have a really interesting story that connects not only kidney patients and the journey that you've been on with kidney disease within your family, but also a connection to the Kidney Foundation, which happened to be a revelation to you very recently. Charlotte, it's a great story. You've got to tell us about it.
I've been running a program called Yoga on the Beach in Parksville, outside in the park, for 10 years. And my friend and I started right after we learned to be yoga instructors in 2012. And we said, let's do something fun for people and let's just offer free yoga on the beach one time, which we did. People came and said, wow, when are you doing it again? And we were like, we'll get back to you. So from that humble beginning, started this program which has become a thing in Parksville, one of the things to do in the summer. We've run over the years between 3 and 5 days a week, depending on who's available. And we get an average of about 50 people out. That's 50. And it's run as a community health program so that we charge just enough to cover our costs, and it's become a major fundraiser as well. So a large portion of our income goes to donation for various organizations. And every year we pick a different one to support. And we've covered the waterfront, I would say, with every kind of organization you can imagine. And this spring in March, I was looking for what am I going to donate money to this summer. And right around the same time, I read in our local newspaper that Chief Rakama, who just had a kidney transplant in our area, and had the kidney donated by one of our town councillors in Qualicum Beach. So it was a very human interest story right off from that. And it was just a little update, and he's doing great, and he's doing well. And I thought, bingo, there's my charity. And because my dad had the third transplant at Vancouver General in the 60s, I thought, why don't I honor my dad and make that our charity? So that's on the face of it what happened. I contacted the Kidney Foundation, and Marie got back to me and said, wow, this is cool. Your dad was involved in the early days. What a great story. And we spent quite a long time chatting and showing her all kinds of information. Because when I told my mom, she's like, well, I have a box full of information. And I went, you do? She's been hauling around this file box for 60 years.
Good 60 years.
60 years.
And I move a lot.
And she moved on. So this was, in itself, this is another like, wow, that's cool. She opens up the box. It's full of documents from those days. Letters, newspaper clippings, notes that she'd made, diaries that she made about how she felt during those days. Just endless documents. It was like a treasure trove. So we let Marie know, and we took some of the documents to show her when we met in person. And so in April, after the class, one of the people that had come, who happens to be my neighbor across the road and down 2 doors, literally, like across the road, he comes over and he says, hey, I don't think you knew that I had a kidney and a pancreas transplant 17 years ago. And I'm like, wow, that is so cool. He says, yeah, my father was involved in the original kidney transplant team in Vancouver in the early days. And it's like, wow, that is cool. He contacts his father. His father is Dr. Ralph Christensen. And he contacts his dad and says, hey, my neighbor, here's the story. He comes back and he says, well, myself and Dr. Maloney did your dad's transplant. And then I'm like, oh my goodness. what it took for the universe to pull us together. I mean, he was a neighbor I would wave to. I mean, that was all it was before. I would have never probably had a big, deep conversation about anything with him, really. And my mom lives across the fence from him and one down. So we're like within feet of it. I could just see the universe going, oh, for heaven's sakes, we got you this close. Let us get you together. So here we are, just like, wow. So that's kind of the whole story of how the connection got remade. And then we go to my mom's box, which she opens up and starts.
And I was totally sort of a mad. I don't know, just I haven't got a word for it, but I'd forgotten I had it. But I have boxes full of stuff, and I always thought I would write something about it in a little story, but I never did it. So now is my chance to use the material for everybody's advance, isn't it?
Isn't it amazing how things have really come full circle, and how yoga on the beach led to this treasure trove of your family's history and journey with kidney disease? And Charlotte, we'd like to acknowledge and thank you for the fundraising efforts of Yoga on the Beach in raising over $3,000 for kidney patients in BC and the Yukon. So, Pat, can you take us back 50 years ago? Tell us about Russel.
Well, I lived in Kelowna. I graduated from Kelowna High School, and my best friend, she decided that we needed to have a big party at her house. So we had this party, and there's this guy over there by the fireplace. He really looks nice. And I didn't have a real boyfriend at that time. So we got to talking, and then a few days later, I get a phone call. Would you like to go to the show? He was the floor manager at a hardware store, and he was kind of a good-looking guy, and we gradually got to be dating quite a bit. And after about 4.5 years, I had worked at the Kelowna Courier. At that time, I was the women's writer and everything that's left over except the sports. And I got to thinking, oh my God, you know, is he going to ask me or isn't he? And so it began. He was going up to Armstrong with me to see my parents, and they didn't know what to think, because here I was suddenly having a real boyfriend. And I moved to Calgary. I became the chief copywriter at the Hudson's Bay Company, job I loved. And then within 3 months, he was in Calgary, and he popped the question. So we got married that August. We were having a really good marriage. We had 3 wonderful children. Charlotte's the oldest, Margaret's the second one, and Richard is the little one. Charlotte is the one who actually suffered through this episode with Russ.
So at what age was Russel originally diagnosed with kidney disease?
It probably started at the age of 17 when he was diagnosed with nephritis. I found out, although he had told me, I hadn't remembered. Although they thought he was okay, it gradually came back. He began to be not feeling well. I began to worry, and that started to take over his energy. As time went on, he couldn't quite fulfill the job at the hardware store. I got more and more worried, and I finally said, I think maybe you should go to a doctor.
Usually when people are diagnosed with kidney disease, it comes as a surprise. Did you and Russel know anything about kidney disease before his diagnosis?
No, we didn't. We didn't have a hot clue, as I say.
Yeah. So it was a huge learning curve for you and the family over the next series of years as you went on this journey.
Yeah.
How does the journey go from there?
Back in Vancouver, I got a job at CKWX as a copywriter, and it was my habit to phone home in the early afternoon every day just to make sure everything was okay, because Russ was there. He wasn't feeling well, and I was worried. So I phoned this afternoon, and he couldn't talk to me. His voice was just not there, and he couldn't make a sound. I just hung up the phone, and I called my doctor. I told him what was happening and should I go right home or what should I do? And he said to me, just put the phone down, Mrs. Crowley, and go back to work because your husband will be dead in a couple of months. So I just dropped the phone and I didn't know what to do. And one of my fellow workers came over and said, what happened? I told her. She disappeared. And then my boss, who was in, of course, the upper office, called me and said, could you come up and talk? And I went up and I thought, well, okay, what am I supposed to do about that? He's probably going to fire me or something. So anyway, he had connections in Vancouver. And he said, first of all, I want you to go straight home. I have no idea if I got on a bus, did somebody take me? I don't know. But I got home and I could see things were not going very well for us. And my boss said to me, can you get your husband to the Vancouver General Hospital in the morning? And of course I said, yes. They took him into the renal unit, which became a new word to me very quickly, or an awful word. And there we were. He was in the hospital. I didn't know at that time how serious it could be. There were only 2 or 3 beds at the time in the unit. Nobody had heard of a transplant. I went over the next day and they put this little thing in here, and it was supposed to remove the problem in your blood system.
So Russell was on peritoneal dialysis. He was on PD at VGH. Is that correct?
That's correct. That was the beginning of the treatment. I have a funny story there, but it wasn't funny really. But he was in a single room, so he was reading this book, and it turned out to be a very funny book. And he was lying in this bed, and he was laughing his head off, and all of a sudden this thing... Yes. So a nurse came running and took the book away from him and wouldn't give it back. She had to... So some things were kind of funny, but I thought, now what do we do?
Sounds like he was quite a character.
Well, he thought that he could get better. And every step that went through the treatment at that time, he would feel better.
So Pat, we were just speaking about how in the mid-60s your late husband Russell was on peritoneal dialysis at VGH. How many times per week was he going in for treatment?
He went I would say 2 or 3 times a week. He would go in like about 5 o'clock at night and be there overnight. Oh. And then by like 9 o'clock in the morning, he was sitting up and feeling good and getting ready to go home again. So then the next step was the kidney machine, which did a lot more for him.
Hemodialysis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the machine was about this long. It was like 3 levels. One went in, one went through, and then the other one went out with the good blood.
Right, yeah.
It was just like a three-tier sandwich, and yeah.
So in total, how many years was Russell on dialysis?
65
to 69.
to 69.
4 years.
Charlotte, you're a young teenager at that time. What are your memories of your dad?
You know, I think when you're a kid, you're very resilient, and whatever comes along, you're not old enough to start to wish it was different because it is what it is, right? And so I just went along and did whatever I needed to do. And I was the oldest, so I mean, I did grow up pretty quickly in that way, but I still had a great childhood because my parents really made a huge effort to let us have a normal childhood. So piano lessons and ballet lessons and summer camp, and we got to do those things. But in among that was this overriding kind of, I guess, concern in me that obviously my dad wasn't well. And a thing that really stands out in my mind was that often the shunt would get blocked. He'd get a clot. And so my dad was in a lot of pain when this happened. And he would have to drive himself from North Vancouver to the hospital, which was a bit of a trip, and park his car and walk himself into the hospital to have them do this very painful process where my understanding was they actually would inject fluid into the shunt to break up the clot. Very painful.
Yeah, it was.
And so he would be gone for this to happen on a pretty regular basis. It was always upsetting to me, I think, every time it happened, because I knew from him talking about it how painful it was, but it was just part of what was happening for, he did that for, 4 or 5 years before he had his transplant.
Yeah, we learned to go along with it between running back and forth to the hospital and working full time, looking after 3 kids. I began to feel sorry for myself. And I don't mind admitting that, but, a few years before the transplant, I just didn't know how I was going to keep on going. In those days, too, a lot of people had no idea what it was all about. And much as I hate to admit it, that one of the biggest things was that my parents did not understand, and they didn't know why Russel had all this trouble and that he had to have more sleep than anybody you ever saw, and things like that. They just didn't understand it.
And one key piece of messaging we always say is kidney disease, it doesn't just affect the patient, it affects the whole family.
You're right.
And Mom often says, especially since she's been going through a lot of this material in the box, it's really brought back a lot of memories, and a lot of old resentments and feelings are coming up for her because she's remembering what it was like and how hard it was, and that there was just no support for the family. There just wasn't any. There was nothing available in any way, really. And in those days, people didn't really talk about it.
No, they didn't.
There wasn't a discussion around how it was for the family or how they were coping. There just wasn't that support.
It was lonely, and sometimes I didn't know what to do, and I admit it. I used to cry a lot, and he'd be at the hospital going through dialysis, and there I was in this big new bed all by myself. And there were a lot of feelings around that too. I tried not to let the kids know that I was crying, but Charlotte especially, I'm sure, knew, because she was very quiet sometimes, and just the way she responded and stuff. I wouldn't say that I knew if I was depending on her so much, but she'd do little things. Like, I remembered that I came home from work one day, and it used to take me till about 6 o'clock at night to get home on the bus. I walked in, and here she was just cleaning up the kitchen and she was quite young at that time, maybe 12, and she had emptied the entire refrigerator, cleaned it all up, put everything back like it should be. You did. You.
Of my own volition, it wasn't on the job list?
No.
Oh.
So Russel and the family, your whole family were really pioneers in a lot of different ways, because Russel was only the 3rd person to have ever had a transplant in BC. You've got to tell us, what was that experience like?
At that time, there were no living donors, and it always had to be someone who had passed away. The match had to be made, permission had to be given, and the kidney had to last until it got to the recipient. So it was a pretty tight time frame, and I know my dad waited for 1 and 2, and then finally the 3rd one worked. But they had two
different times for the same operation. The first one was a motorcycle accident.
Must have been a young guy, and his parent couldn't be reached.
So Russ comes home and carry on. And then the second one came, and it wasn't suitable by the time it got to him. So, home again, wait again. And then the next time, I guess it worked because I didn't know. I was at work, and I got this call from the renal unit saying, well, Russell's on his way.
So that would have been the third call, the third time. What was that like when you got that call?
He was having it, and they assured me that it would work. And so I was happy and glad and relieved.
When was the first time you saw Russell after?
2 days, because even at that, I had to put on him the gown and the whole bed. I couldn't touch him. I couldn't, get within that midst of him and stuff like that. He didn't seem to have much reaction. He said, well, I've got it now. He says, I'm supposed to be out of here in 2 weeks. Well, this is the milk story. One of the things he couldn't have prior to the transplant was milk. He hadn't had a glass of milk in like 5 years, and he could hardly wait. I guess they kind of liked him, and so they pampered him and brought him a glass of milk, and he liked it so much that they brought him another one. And pretty soon he had swollen ankles. And so he had to stay in the hospital an extra 2 weeks or a week or something. So he couldn't come home. And I said, did you do that on purpose?
Being the third transplant recipient, was that anything that impacted Russell? Was there a source of pride there?
He did. He felt wonderful. He freely was happy, and now I can get on with life.
Charlotte, do you have any fond recollections of that time, first time seeing your dad?
I honestly don't remember.
He looked pretty good. I have a picture.
But he looked pretty good, and he was always a fairly dark complexion anyways, so you didn't notice like flushing up and that. You wouldn't really see a lot of it. And he always had a good suntan when he was out in the sun. So I believe in the beginning he had more energy, and he was always a pretty optimistic person. He would put on a good face anyway, so it was sometimes hard to know really what was going on.
Yeah.
Really.
That's true.
But I think the initial days, it was kind of euphoric because it finally happened and we all were hopeful. And so my expectation as a kid was that it was all done. Yeah. Off we go in the future, and it's all happy now.
Just listening to you both speak about your husband and your dad seems like a very understated gentleman, because really being the third person that's having a transplant, he was part of those who paved the way for decades and decades of improvement within renal care.
Yep.
Within BC, there's a real history there. How did things go post-transplant?
Yeah, they went wonderful for quite a while, and I guess it was a year and a half when he started to bloat here in his stomach and stuff like that, and I thought, oh no, not again. And all through that time, I was writing letters to myself because I didn't want people to know that I felt like I couldn't handle it. I didn't want Russ to know how bad I felt.
You and your husband did a wonderful job really of trying to keep things as normalized as possible.
Of the 3 kids, the boy, Richard, in a way suffered the most. I went to put him to bed one night, and Russ was still on dialysis, and he said, does my daddy ever come home? I miss my daddy. And I broke into tears. You can't explain to a 4 or 5-year-old that maybe he's not coming home. Then when he died, he just turned, and was very quiet.
And your husband was at home with the family for, was it a couple of years?
Not quite 2 years, but almost.
I always remember as a kid that it was Christmas time and he felt really ill, but we didn't know he did. He lasted right through Christmas, and I think it was the next day, maybe Boxing Day, he said, I have to go to the hospital. But he kept going right up until that day because he wanted us all to have Christmas.
Yeah.
And then he died in early January. So
January.
That was your last Christmas together as a family.
Christmas together, and he was so strong and determined that I knew even as a kid that he went as far as he could go.
Yeah.
He was done. So.
Yeah. There was no other thing they could do.
Any final thoughts you'd like to share with our viewers?
I have to say that what I've seen since we opened up that box is my mom has really gone down memory lane, and a lot of feelings and emotions are coming up, and a lot of things that she's still carrying around.
Yeah, that's true.
And she spent a lot of time looking through things and remembering and reading her letters, and it's been quite an emotional journey, and also for me.
A big part of my life it was, you know.
Yeah, and you were young, Mom.
Yeah.
My mom, I think, was 39 when my dad passed away.
Yeah.
And when I think back to then, 39.
Yep.
They didn't even get going. I mean,
That's right.
they were just not even in their middle ages. They were young.
I know that Russ really tried to be a help to others, even when he was sick. He was always there for someone. If they needed something, or if they needed something he could provide, he would, and he would try. I think his attitude kept him going until he'd had the transplant, and that was his goal, because he thought he would have more life then.
Thank you both for taking the time, joining us on Plugged In today. It's been an honor.
My heart goes out to you for all the trouble you've done today.
It's been a pleasure. It's really nice to hear the name Russel Crowley, and now to know and to have learned something about not just the kidney patient, but the man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The father.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
There's more to this story. Patricia and her late husband Russel Crowley were part of a small group of citizens who founded the BC branch of the Kidney Foundation in January 1967 in Vancouver, BC. In January 2023, we will commemorate the 56th anniversary of the BC branch as we bring you part 2 of our interview with Patricia Crowley and her daughter Charlotte. And they will share a wealth of information about the founding of the BC branch that has been previously tucked away for decades and recently rediscovered by Patricia and her daughter.